They lined up to marry the richest Apache woman alive, but she rode past every single one of them, chasing the only man who had once turned his back on her, and the dust that followed her horse carried a truth no one in that town was ready to admit. 3 months earlier, that same woman had walked those streets in a worn-out dress, fabric thin at the elbows, boots scuffed by miles of dry earth, her hair loosely tied as if she had nothing worth guarding, and the town had treated her exactly the way it treated anything it didn't understand, with curiosity first, then quiet judgment, and finally open disregard. Men leaned on porch rails and watched her pass, some tossing her a coin like she was part of the scenery, others offering help that felt more like a bargain than kindness, and she took it all in silence, eyes lowered, listening more than speaking, measuring something none of them could see. The saloon doors creaked behind her as laughter spilled into the street, thick with whiskey and arrogance, and inside, she saw men boasting about land, cattle, and women like they were all things that could be counted and owned, and she wondered, not for the first time, if love had ever lived in a place like this or if it had been traded away long before she arrived. Then there was Ethan Cole, standing at the far end of the bar, hat low, hands steady, not laughing, not joining, just watching the room like he didn't quite belong to it. And when her eyes found his, he didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't step forward the way the others did. He simply looked, long enough to see her, truly see her, and then he looked away. That moment stayed with her longer than any word spoken that day, because it wasn't rejection born from pride or cruelty. It was something quieter, something heavier, like he had chosen distance over something he didn't trust. Later, when she crossed his path again by the water trough outside the general store, she tested him. Just a few words, simple, harmless, the kind that usually opened doors. But Ethan only shook his head once, slow, almost respectful, and said, "You don't need anything from me," before stepping aside to let her pass. No pity, no interest, no hidden hunger, just a boundary drawn clean in the dust. The wind moved through the street, lifting the hem of her dress, carrying the scent of leather and sunburned wood, and for the first time since she had begun her quiet search, she felt something shift inside her, not anger, not pride, but a question she couldn't answer, because every other man in that town had tried to take something from her the moment they thought she had nothing. But the only man who had nothing to gain was the one who refused to take anything at all, and she didn't know yet that the choice she would make because of that silence would cost her more than any lie she had told to get here. By the third day, the town had already decided who she was, and more importantly, what she was worth, and that judgment hung in the air thicker than the heat that pressed down on every wooden roof and dusty road. She noticed how quickly kindness turned into calculation, how every offer came with a weight behind it, something expected in return, something unspoken but understood, and she let it happen, because that was the point of all this, to see clearly what could not be seen when power stood. In the room, a rancher named Wallace Green made his move first, a man with polished boots and a voice too smooth to be honest. He offered her work, a place to sleep, food that did not come from scraps, and the way he spoke made it sound generous, but the way his eyes lingered made it feel like ownership. She accepted, not because she needed it, but because she needed to know, and for a while, it looked like she had found what others would call security, a roof that did not leak, meals that came on time, and a place at the edge of a life that seemed stable. But something inside it felt hollow, like a stage set too carefully arranged, and every conversation with Wallace circled back to what she could become under his protection, never who she already was. In the evenings, she would sit on the porch and watch the road, the same stretch of dirt where wagons rolled through and strangers passed without names, and sometimes she would see Ethan Cole in the distance, moving slow, steady, never in a hurry, never looking toward the house, and that absence began to feel louder than all the attention she received inside it. One afternoon, the town gathered near the trading post, voices rising and falling like wind through dry grass, and Wallace stood beside her, one hand resting just a little too comfortably at her back, as if placing a claim where none had been given, and he spoke about plans, about future, about what she would have if she stayed, and the people nodded, approving, because this was the kind of story they understood, a man providing, a woman accepting, a life arranged neatly within the lines they trusted. Then someone mentioned Ethan, almost as a joke, a man who kept to himself, who did not play the game, who turned away from things others chased, and laughter followed, light but sharp, the kind that tries to shrink a person without ever touching them. Wallace leaned closer and asked her, in a tone meant to be heard, why she had not chosen someone simpler, someone easier, someone like him. And for a moment, she hesitated, because the truth was not something she could speak without breaking everything she had built. So she did what the town expected. She smiled, just enough, and said she had already made her choice. Across the street, Ethan stood near the hitching rail, one hand resting on worn leather, his posture unchanged. But there was something in the stillness, something final, like a door closing without sound. He did not argue, did not react, did not even look surprised. He simply turned, adjusted his hat against the sun, and walked away as if the decision had always belonged to him. The wind carried dust between them, soft, almost gentle, but it blurred the line just enough that when she tried to follow his silhouette, it was already gone, and in that quiet, surrounded by approval, comfort, and everything she had set out to test, she felt the first crack form in something she had believed she could control. Days passed, and the house that once felt like an answer began to sound different at night, quieter in a way that made every small detail echo, the ticking of a clock, the creak of wood settling under the cool desert air, the distant call of something unseen beyond the fence line. And Alara sat on the edge of the bed Wallace had given her, hands resting still in her lap, staring at nothing, because there was nothing here that truly belonged to her. Wallace spoke often about the future, about expanding his land, about how people in town had begun to notice her, how they respected her now that she stood beside him, and every word sounded polished, practiced, like something rehearsed in front of a mirror, and she listened, nodded when needed. But the meaning slid past her like dust through open fingers. One evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the sky in slow fading colors, Wallace handed her a small box, wrapped carefully, tied with a thin strip of leather, and when she opened it, she found a necklace, silver, clean, expensive in a way that felt almost too perfect, and he smiled, expecting something, perhaps gratitude, perhaps confirmation, perhaps the quiet agreement that she now belonged in. The life he had built for her. She held the necklace for a moment, feeling its weight, not heavy, but certain, like a decision already made, and she realized then that everything Wallace gave her came with that same invisible weight, not kindness, not love, but expectation shaped into form. She thanked him, because that was what the moment required, and he seemed satisfied, turning away to speak about guests arriving next week, about how she should present herself, how she should speak, how she should be seen. Later that night, she stepped outside alone, the air cooler now, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and distant water, and she walked toward the edge of the property where the land opened wide and empty, where nothing stood between her and the horizon except silence. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the one thing she had kept from before, a small piece of worn cloth, torn at the edge, barely noticeable to anyone else. But to her it carried the memory of the road, of the dust, of the moment when someone had looked at her and chosen distance instead of advantage. She turned the cloth between her fingers slowly, as if it might tell her something she had missed, and for the first time since she had made her choice, she allowed herself to ask the question she had been avoiding, not about Wallace, not about the town, but about Ethan, about why his refusal had felt more real than every acceptance she had received since. The next morning, the town gathered again, voices rising, horses shifting in the heat, and news traveled fast, faster than she had expected. Because a group of riders had been seen at the edge of the valley, Apache riders, moving with purpose, and the tone of the town shifted in an instant. Curiosity replaced with tension, respect mixed with uncertainty, and Wallace stood straighter, speaking louder, as if control could be claimed by volume alone. Alara felt it before she saw them, that quiet presence that did not need attention to exist, and when the riders appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the light, everything in the town seemed to pause, just for a second, just long enough for truth to begin catching up with the story she had been telling, and she knew, without anyone saying a word, that whatever came next would not belong to the life Wallace had planned, and somewhere beyond the crowd, beyond the noise, Beyond the careful lines drawn by expectation, there was only one person who would not see her differently when the truth arrived, and he was the only one who was no longer there. The riders did not rush. They did not shout. They did not need to, because the kind of presence they carried moved slower than fear but settled deeper. And as their horses stepped into the edge of town, hooves pressing into dry earth with quiet certainty, every conversation faded into something smaller, something uncertain, like the town itself was trying to remember how to stand. Alara remained still among them, her hands at her sides, her breathing steady, though inside something long held was beginning to rise, not panic, not doubt, but recognition, the kind that does not ask permission before it changes everything. Wallace stepped forward first, of course he did, adjusting his coat, lifting his chin just enough to appear in control, his voice carrying across the open space as he greeted the riders with a confidence that felt rehearsed, as if this moment could be shaped the same way he shaped everything else, through tone and posture and the illusion of ownership. But the lead rider did not answer him, did not even look in his direction. Instead, his eyes moved past Wallace, past the gathered crowd, until they found Alara, and in that single moment, the air shifted, not violently, not dramatically, but with a quiet clarity that no one could ignore. The rider dismounted slowly, boots touching ground with the kind of ease that comes from knowing exactly where you stand in the world, and he walked toward her, each step measured, deliberate, as if every inch of distance carried meaning. People in the crowd began to murmur, not loudly, not yet, but enough to break the silence that had settled, and Wallace turned, confusion flickering across his face for the first time, because this was not how things were supposed to unfold, not in front of him, not in a place he believed he understood. The rider stopped a few feet from Alara, close enough now that the details became clear, the markings, the worn leather, the quiet authority that did not need to prove itself, and without raising his voice, without turning the moment into something larger than it already was, he inclined his head, just slightly, not as a servant, not as a stranger, but as someone acknowledging what had always been true. Alara felt the weight of every eye in the town settle onto her, felt the shift ripple outward like wind across open land, and she knew there was no more space left for silence. No more room to remain unseen, because the truth had arrived not with force, but with patience. Wallace spoke again, louder this time, asking questions that sounded more like demands, trying to pull the moment back into something he could control, but his words fell short, slipping past the rider who had already made his choice about what mattered here. Alara stepped forward then, just one step, small, almost unnoticeable, but enough to change the distance between who she had been and who she was about to become, and as she did, the worn cloth in her pocket pressed lightly against her fingers, a reminder of a different kind of truth, one that had nothing to do with titles or wealth or the approval of a watching crowd. She could feel the town holding its breath, waiting for explanation, waiting for something that would make sense of what they were seeing, but sense was never part of what she came here to find. The rider spoke her name then, softly, clearly, a name no one in that town had ever heard before, and it moved through the air like a line drawn across everything she had built, everything she had tested, everything she had chosen. Wallace's hand dropped from her back, not dramatically, not in anger, but in uncertainty, as if the ground beneath him had shifted just enough to make him question his footing. And in that moment, standing between two worlds that no longer fit together the way they once had, Alara realized that the truth did not change how people saw her. It only revealed how they had always been looking. The crowd began to shift uncomfortably, some people taking slow steps back, others whispering to each other, their voices low but sharp. Wallace's face tightened, his eyes moving from Alara to the rider, then back to her, as if trying to reconcile something that didn't belong in the space between them. He spoke, his words coming out fast, demanding answers, trying to fill the silence that had grown too heavy for him to ignore. But the rider did not respond. His attention remained fixed on Alara, and for the first time, Alara saw the difference between being watched and being truly seen. It wasn't just the recognition of her name. It was the way the rider stood, unhurried, unbothered by the tension that had begun to coil around the crowd. He was simply there, as if this moment was nothing more than a natural progression, and in his presence, everything that had felt forced before now seemed unnecessary, even hollow. Alara stood tall, her eyes meeting the rider's, and for the first time, she felt the weight of her own choices shift. Wallace's words continued to fade, lost to the distance between the past she had left and the future that was unfolding before her. The rider's steady gaze did not break, and something in it stirred something deep within her, something long, buried under layers of survival and pretending. He knew. He always had. The world around them seemed to fall away, the heat of the day fading into a coolness that she had not expected, as if the very air had shifted to accommodate the truth she had spent so long trying to outrun. She turned slightly toward Wallace, her body moving on its own, and for the first time, she found herself speaking with the quiet certainty she had been missing. "I don't belong here anymore," she said, her voice soft but clear. Wallace's face twisted with confusion, frustration, but there was nothing he could say that would change the truth in her words. He had been a part of the story she told herself to fit in, to survive, but he was not the answer to the question that had been burning inside her. The rider stepped forward then, just a step, just enough to close the distance between them, and Alara did not flinch, did not look away. He reached out, not in expectation, but in acknowledgement, and placed a hand gently at her shoulder. There was no grand gesture, no loud declaration. There was only the quiet certainty that she had made the right choice, even if she had not known it when she first came here. The town watched, some with curiosity, others with confusion, but it no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered was that, in this moment, she was no longer pretending, no longer hiding behind a mask of what others thought she should be. She was free. Wallace remained standing in the same spot, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to say something, anything, to fill the void that had appeared between them. But no words came. Alara didn't need to explain herself any longer. She had already made her peace with the past, and now, she could finally walk forward, unburdened. As she turned away, the rider beside her, his presence like a quiet promise, Alara felt the weight of the past finally fall away, and for the first time, she could breathe. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to walk it. Together, the wind carried a chill through the trees as Alara and the rider walked side by side, their steps unhurried, as if the earth beneath their feet had always known the path they were on. The town faded behind them, smaller now, like a place in a story that had already been told, and ahead, the horizon stretched wide, uncertain but inviting. The rider did not speak as they walked, but there was a quiet understanding between them, a shared recognition of the journey that had begun long before either of them had set foot on this road. Alara glanced at him, the man who had appeared as if summoned by the very truth she had been running from, and found in his eyes not the judgment she had feared, but the calm certainty of someone who had already made peace with the world around him. She had expected to feel the weight of her choices bearing down on her as they walked, the burden of her decision to leave everything behind, but instead, she felt lighter, freer than she had in years. She had been so afraid of letting go, of facing the unknown, but now, with each step, the fear seemed smaller, quieter, as if it had no place in the life she was about to build. After a while, the rider spoke, his voice low but steady, carrying the kind of quiet authority that had drawn her in from the start. "You're not the first to come this way," he said, his eyes still on the path ahead. "But you'll be the last to carry your past." Alara frowned slightly, unsure of the meaning behind his words. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. "The past is like the dust," the rider replied, glancing at her for a brief moment. "It clings to you, follows you wherever you go, but in the end, it's only the ground beneath your feet. What matters is what you choose to build." Alara thought about his words as they continued walking, the rhythmic sound of their boots on the dirt road filling the silence between them. She had spent so many years trying to build a life that fit into other people's expectations, trying to prove that she could belong to a world that had never truly welcomed her. But now, with every step, she was building something new, something that was hers alone. The road ahead was long, but it no longer felt like a distance she had to cover alone. The rider was right. She was not the first to leave the life she had known, but she would be the one to leave it behind, not as a burden, but as a foundation for something better. She had learned that love could not be bought, not with promises or possessions, and that trust was not a currency that could be traded. It was earned, given freely, and built on the quiet moments that were shared in silence and understanding. They reached a small stream by late afternoon, the water flowing clear and cool beneath the shade of the trees. The rider stopped for a moment, bending down to take a drink, and Alara followed his lead, kneeling beside him. She cupped her hands in the water, feeling the coolness against her skin, and for the first time, she allowed herself to truly let go of the life she had left behind. There was no more pretending, no more masks to wear. She was not the poor Apache girl they had once seen, nor the woman she had tried to be for so many years. She was just Alara, and for the first time, she was enough. As they continued on, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, and Alara felt something shift inside her, not the weight of past choices, but the lightness of new beginnings. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to walk, and for the first time, she was not afraid. The days began to blur into each other as Alara and the rider continued their journey across the open land, the road stretching endlessly before them, wide and unyielding. The world around them was vast, the sky always just a little too big, and the land beneath their feet seemed to hum with a quiet energy, as though it knew their every step before they made it. The rider moved with a calm certainty, never rushing, always steady, and Alara found herself keeping pace, not out of obligation, but because it felt right. The air had cooled, and the night seemed to stretch longer as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting everything in shades of orange and gold. They spoke little, but the silence between them was never uncomfortable, never awkward. It was a space they both seemed to understand, a space where words didn't need to fill the gaps because the land, the sky, and the quiet between them said everything that needed to be said. One evening, as they sat beside a small fire, the sound of crackling wood breaking the stillness, Alara turned to the rider, her mind full of thoughts she hadn't yet allowed herself to voice. "How did you know I was ready?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the question itself might shatter the calm they had built. The rider looked at her then, his expression unreadable in the flickering light of the fire. He didn't answer right away, and Alara felt the weight of the question hang between them, as if it were something more than just curiosity. It was a question about herself, about what she had been searching for all this time. Finally, the rider spoke, his voice low and steady. "You knew," he said simply. "You always did. You just needed to see it for yourself." Alara didn't know how to respond to that. It wasn't what she had expected, but somehow, it was exactly what she needed to hear. She had always thought that someone else would tell her when she was ready, that someone else would show her the way. But now, sitting by the fire, with the stars stretching out above her and the man beside her not asking anything more than her presence, she realized that the only person who needed to believe in her was herself. The fire crackled again, sending a brief flare of light into the night, and Alara's thoughts turned inward. She had spent so many years trying to fit into a life that never truly belonged to her, trying to be what others wanted her to be, that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply be herself. But now, with each passing day, with every step they took on this road together, she felt a part of herself returning, piece by piece, like a puzzle she had forgotten how to put together. The rider stood then, stretching out his long limbs before turning his gaze to the darkened horizon. "We should rest," he said, his voice calm, as though he could see something she couldn't. Alara nodded, the weight of his words settling over her like a quiet promise. She lay down beneath the stars, the earth cool against her skin, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to drift into sleep without worry, without doubt. The world around her was vast, but it no longer felt like something she had to conquer. It was simply a place to be, and for the first time, she felt like she belonged in it. The next morning, the sun rose slowly, casting the land in a golden light that made everything look new again. Alara stood, stretching her arms above her head, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin as the rider packed up the camp. She didn't know where the road would lead them, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to walk it. The future was still uncertain, but she was ready to face it, not as the woman she had been, but as the woman she was becoming. The road ahead was long, but it was hers, and for the first time, she wasn't walking alone. The sun climbed higher, bathing the landscape in a harsh light that only seemed to deepen the quiet between them. Alara walked a few steps ahead, her eyes focused on the horizon, yet her mind kept circling back to the choices that had brought her here, to this road, to this moment. The rider moved beside her, steady and constant, as if the journey was nothing but a natural rhythm to him, something that had always been in motion, while she felt as if each step was part of a story that had only just begun. They hadn't spoken much in the past few days, but there was no distance between them. It was a silence that didn't ask for words, but one that seemed to say everything that needed to be said. Alara could feel the weight of her past lifting, but it wasn't gone completely. It wasn't something that could just be erased. She had spent so many years carrying it, hiding it, believing it was who she was. But now, with every mile they traveled, she began to understand that it wasn't her burden to carry anymore. The past had shaped her, yes, but it didn't define her. It was only a piece of the puzzle. The rider glanced at her, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment before returning to the road ahead. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice low but clear, breaking the silence in a way that felt like a natural conclusion to the thoughts she hadn't realized she was thinking. She nodded, though she wasn't sure how much he meant by that. She had come a long way, but the road ahead felt just as long, if not longer. It was a strange feeling, this mix of freedom and uncertainty. "I thought I would be afraid," she said quietly, almost to herself. "But I'm not." "You never were," he replied, his voice still steady, never hurried. "You just had to remember that." His words hung in the air for a moment, and Alara let them settle around her like dust in the wind. She had spent so many years trying to prove something, to be something that others expected her to be. She had played the part so well, hiding behind the mask of who she thought she should be, that she had forgotten who she truly was beneath it all. But now, she felt the weight of that mask slip away, piece by piece. The rider's pace never faltered, and neither did hers. They moved in tandem, each step a quiet agreement that they were on this path together, not as two separate people, but as one shared journey, bound by the road and the silence that stretched between them. The day wore on, and with it, the landscape around them began to change. The land was still vast, but now it was tinged with something else, something more. Alara could feel it in the air, the subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the world was waiting for them to arrive at some unspoken destination. She didn't know what that destination was yet, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. The uncertainty of the future no longer felt like something to fear, but something to embrace. They stopped at the edge of a small stream by the time the sun had begun to dip low, the sky now a soft shade of pink. The rider lowered his pack and sat on a nearby rock, looking out over the water. Alara joined him, sitting just a little apart, but close enough that she could feel the quiet presence beside her. The moment felt peaceful, still, like a pause in the middle of a song. For the first time in a long time, Alara allowed herself to just be. No plans, no expectations, no need to be anything other than herself. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer filled with the weight of unspoken words, but with the understanding that this was enough. The world didn't need to be louder, didn't need to be more than this quiet moment by the stream, with the sun setting slowly in the distance. It was enough, and for the first time, she knew that wherever the road took them next, she would be ready to walk it, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. As the days continued to pass, Alara felt the rhythm of her life shift once again, like the gentle ebb of a tide pulling her forward without force, but with undeniable certainty. The land around her had changed, the terrain shifting from the open plains to more rugged paths, and each step they took felt like it was leading her into something new, something she couldn't yet name. The rider remained a steady presence beside her, never hurried, always patient, but she could feel the subtle change in him too, like something had awakened in him as well, something long dormant. There was a quiet strength in his silence, a wisdom that didn't need to be spoken, but that she felt in the way he moved, in the way he looked at the land and then at her, as though waiting for something to reveal itself. They stopped by a cliff one afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rocky landscape. Alara sat down on the edge, her legs dangling over the side, and looked out across the valley below, the river winding like a silver thread through the green of the valley floor. The rider stood a few feet away, his eyes fixed on the horizon, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was in these moments of stillness that Alara felt the most connected to the world around her, to the land, and to herself. She had spent so much of her life trying to escape, trying to outrun the past, but now, here, with the sun setting and the land stretched out before her, she felt like she had finally come home, not to a place, but to herself. She turned to the rider, her voice quiet but firm. "Do you ever wonder what's waiting for us at the end of the road?" she asked. He didn't immediately respond, but when he did, his voice was steady, as though he had been waiting for the question. "I don't think there's an end," he said simply. "There's just more road. More of the world to see, more of yourself to discover. There's no end to it, Alara. Not if you're willing to keep walking." Alara let his words sink in, the simplicity of them echoing in her mind. She had spent so long trying to find an end, a place where she could rest, where she could stop running, but maybe he was right. Maybe there was no end. Maybe the journey itself was enough. She stood up slowly, stretching her arms above her head, and felt the cool breeze against her skin. The sun was almost gone now, leaving only a faint glow on the horizon. It was a quiet, peaceful moment, and for the first time, Alara felt like she could breathe fully, without the weight of the past pressing down on her chest. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She was simply being, and that was enough. The rider turned to face her then, his expression softening for the first time in days. "Ready to keep walking?" he asked, his voice still calm, but with a hint of something else in it, something warmer, something like an invitation. Alara nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "Always," she replied, and for the first time, she meant it. The road ahead was long, and she didn't know what lay beyond the next bend, but she was ready for it. She wasn't afraid of the unknown anymore. The journey had become her own, and she was no longer just a passenger in her own life. She was the one driving it forward. And that, she realized, was the greatest freedom of